The goal, Rabbi Irving Greenberg writes, is to go back thousands of years and to experience first the crushing bitterness of slavery, and next the wild, exhilarating release of freedom. The rabbi is talking, of course, about Passover, that set of days that tells the ancient story that you heard about again today, a story rehearsed in the Seders, that you may have experienced in your own home, still experience, or friends' homes, or here at church, that journey of the Israelites from literal slavery into, as Greenberg says, wild, exhilarating freedom. Passover as a story may begin with the Israelites, but of course it didn't end with them. We wish it had. That, in fact, is what makes witnessing to the story and rituals of this season so powerful and useful. Just this week, in fact, was the day that we were, as members of the human family, invited to hold space for the Armenian genocide of 1915, the systematic and premeditated extermination of 1.5 million Armenians that began on April 24th of that year, and for which the term genocide was coined, by the way. For at least one of our members here, Lisa Nicole, that genocide is a part of her own family's history. She, being descendant of the part of the story of those who escaped to liberation, broken as their lives were in so many ways by what happened. There are any number of such stories in history, of course, but why go back in time, right? Because even as we sit here, people fleeing literal slavery struggle. Kailash Satyarthi, someone I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of times when I lived in India, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize of 2014, won that prize for his ongoing work to free people from bondage, slavery, and trafficking, most of his work being focused on the freeing of children from such conditions all over the world. And there is, of course, also the parallel experience, Passover experience of oppression of pharaohs all over the modern world who rule with fear and violence, and the similar oppression of peoples trapped in prisons of nations mired, essentially, in economic despair. Some of those people who clamor at the walls and the boundaries of this country right now, or die parched in the deserts that lie between us and them, or 1,000 fates in between. I imagine we all know something about what oppression feels like, or have some experience of imprisonment that brings it close enough. However that has shown up in our own lives. A bunch of us read the book by Nadine Burke Harris, The Deepest Well, and met to discuss it this week. Nadine Burke Harris, of course, is the Surgeon General of California now, a position created for her. Our governor was brilliant in this move. I cannot wait, as I know many of you can't, to see what Dr. Burke Harris does in that role. Dr. Burke Harris, of course, is a pediatrician, and she began her work starting a clinic in Bayview, where she noticed that certain illnesses and issues were showing up in her clinic with alarming regularity. putting the pieces slowly together, study by study, research of her own mixed with conversations with her peers, she ultimately connected the dots between adverse childhood experiences and long-term physical or neurological changes of the kind that made certain diseases and things like learning disabilities more likely. In other words, or in some cases, 32 times more likely. One of the characteristics of some of these adversities, 10 she comes to catalog, involves living in a place where we cannot recover from the fight or flight experience. In other words, it's okay for our bodies to experience a momentary fear or threat, but what if, as she puts it, the bear lives in the house with you? For instance, what if the parent or caregiver is an alcoholic, or has mental illness, or is violent? Or what if the bear lives just outside the house, so you can't really relax for long? What if the bear is gang violence, or you are gay, lesbian, or transgendered, or you have brown or black skin in a world of anti-blackness, or you have a disability in a world that is ableist? In those cases, there is no or almost only limited moments of safety and being able to recover from what is hard and scary in your life and world. I know white upper-class folks from New York City who know such prisons firsthand. And middle-class Asians in Texas, even in Austin, Texas, who know such prisons. And people who are Black almost everywhere in America who still know them. I bet we all know prisons of heart and body of some kind that hopefully we've left behind us, but maybe ones we're still held hostage to. This week, I got a ferocious case of the stomach virus, and I recalled how bodies can be prisons too. These bars of illness that hold you in pain or powerless. But it was illness this week that also got me thinking about liberation. Have you ever had the stomach virus? Anyone here ever had a ferocious case of the stomach virus? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about, right? Go with me and remember. Let's really have fun today at church, shall we? First, you feel kind of nauseated, right? I am really going to make you go with me. And you get nauseated long enough that you're in that appalling place of actually hoping you will throw up. And then you get your wish, your horrible wish. You get sick. And it is never pretty. Quite the opposite, in fact. Maybe one of the most unpretty things we as human beings do, but I won't take up that conversation or debate today. Anyway, it's awful, and a lot else that goes along with it. But the good news about the stomach virus, at least, is that it's usually only about 24 hours before you are at least on the mend. And how good do we feel then? Even weak and not 100% better, how good do we feel the day after the stomach virus? To feel free of that nausea, it's like a new lease on life. Each day is like Disneyland. And you think, if you're like me, I do each time, you think perhaps, I will never again take my health for granted after that. So much gratitude, so much empathy for those who live with illness, who don't get well in 24 hours. But there is a cautionary tale here, right? Because inevitably, we likely do forget how lucky we are to be liberated. All that empathy for the imprisoned, or we're at risk of forgetting. The week before last, I got to go to I think it was the San Francisco Film Festival, is that what it's called? To see Unsettled. It's a film made by San Francisco director and producer Tom Shepard and producer Jen Gilliman. The full title of the documentary is Unsettled, Seeking Refuge in America. And it chronicles the experience of 4 GLBTQ asylum seekers coming to the Bay Area. And it tells some of their background story, and then it witnesses to their experience of seeking asylum here and making a life here. And I went because one of the 4 people was a person that our church's guardian group had worked to support, Junior Maima. Did any of you meet Junior ever? Yeah. So because of this, the documentary featured, I am proud to say, members of our congregation, the Dar family, who host Junior for a while. Who else is featured? Is that it? Oh, yeah. Yes, Phil Allison is in it. And Galen Workman, who's helping me out with lines in the front. He was featured prominently, which was really fun. He was, however, and I think he'll also be quick to point this out too, generally shown as the guy carrying incredibly big, heavy, overpacked suitcases up and down, usually up, unwieldy staircases, as Junior moves between temporary housing situations, while Junior, who is half Galen's age, carries light bags of shoes and other things. So there are these comedic moments. It was great. One painful part of the documentary is hearing about the abuse and hate and fear that all 4 suffered in their home countries and in their families of origin, too. Fathers who smashed their sons' heads against the wall, women harassed every time they leave their home onto the streets, gay men dragged out into the streets and beaten or murdered, mothers who disown their children, and even one who tries to poison her daughter. The movie, though, ends brilliantly with this scene. One of the 4 that we have followed flies to Canada to meet his sister. She's been granted asylum in Canada. They are from Syria, where the daily violence, even if you aren't gay or lesbian or trans, is unrelenting. Bombings, assassinations, terror. You never see, actually, I don't think, his sister's face, just the salt and pepper of her hair from behind, so you know she's not a child. You know very little about her. Her brother approaches her with a teddy bear in front of his face, like a peace offering and a bridge across the time since they last saw each other, a decade, I think, maybe more, and all that happened in that decade apart. And then she sees him, and she runs and falls into his arms, and in that moment, it hits you in the gut, still hits you in the gut, what liberation and oppression feel like, because you can feel it in her sobs. They speak no words, but you can feel and hear the depths of loss and injury, of relief and fear and joy, and above all, release. She's free. Of course, we know from watching the journey of the other four that her journey has only really just begun. Making a new life where she has landed will be hard, even under the best of circumstances. Liberation, as the story rightly tells us, even on the other side of the sea, even when the chariots with their cracking whips at your cheek and their wheels at your heels, even when they are left behind you, you still face a desert, and years before you find your homeland, know it as home. But something new has begun. It's this moment between slavery and freedom, right there, all of it. And somehow this seems like the moment we should never forget. And the risk will be, of course, to forget. When liberation is familiar and easy, it's easy to forget. And pain and unpleasantness, who could blame anyone from wanting to leave any of it behind? Who could blame any of us from wanting to leave it behind? But we have to remember, because that remembering will be the fuel that we can use to power our work to liberate others, right? So what do we do to remember? I mean, if you have your own moments, read your journals. Remember the first 12-step meeting and the person who called you every day afterwards, right, to keep you sober. Or remember when you stood aside this sea of illness and didn't know how you'd get across it, and someone came and stood beside you and did what they could to part the way. Or who reached in and rescued you from a prison when you were maybe young or felt powerless and couldn't rescue yourself, even kept you part of the way out of that place. Or maybe, if you aren't a keeper of a story of liberation that is your own, fortune blessed as we can be, maybe we just resolve to stand in the place where other people yearning to be free walk today, and let their stories soften our hearts, awaken us to courage. Because if we do, I imagine one day we are likely to find ourselves carrying enormous, overstuffed, awkward bags up some stairwell, straining and contorting, but also really, really happy to be doing our part to be freeing even one life from its imprisoned place or places. So what's the liberation you are called to pay forward? What seas can you split? Or maybe you're already doing that work. And if so, huge blessings in it. Happy Passover, everyone. Bless us all in the work of liberating ourselves and others to new chapters of life and love. Amen.